Story 1. The smell of the hospital always clung to my clothes. Not the scent of antiseptic or medical alcohol, as many people imagine, but something else. A mixture of fear, hope, fragility, and death. I've been working on an ambulance for 10 years, but I've never gotten used to that smell. My name is Mason Reed. None of my friends understood why a guy like me, 28 years old, a graduate of a prestigious university with a business administration degree, chose to drive an ambulance. They said I was wasting my potential, but they didn't know about the dream. The dream of an old man in a black coat. I had dreamed of him every night for 3 straight months after my grandmother passed away. That old man stood by her bed, not menacingly, but as if waiting. And when my grandmother took her last breath, he took her hand and they vanished together. Not a ghostly disappearance like in movies, they simply dissolved like mist in the sunlight. When I woke up, I knew my grandmother was gone. The phone rang 20 minutes later. She had passed away in her sleep. Since then, I started believing in the spiritual world. Not the silly ghost stories of Hollywood movies, but something more subtle, a delicate membrane between life and death that we can sometimes perceive. That's why I became an ambulance driver. I wanted to be close to that boundary, where life and death intersect. And I've encountered more strange things than you could ever imagine. My first shift was supposed to be a simple one, shadowing a veteran EMT named Jack Thompson and learning the ropes. Jack was a big man with a scraggly beard and the wary eyes of someone who had seen too much tragedy. He had a reputation for being quiet and not very friendly with new recruits. "Reed, right?" Jack asked as I approached the ambulance. "Yes, Mason Reed." "I don't care about your middle name. Do you believe in ghosts?" I hesitated. This wasn't the question I expected on my first day. "I think there are unexplainable things," I replied, trying to be evasive. Jack stared at me. "Answer my question, do you believe?" "Yes," I said, "I believe." A rare smile flickered across his face. "Good, because tonight you're going to meet one of them." I sat in the passenger seat, trying to maintain a calm facade. Jack said nothing more, and the night passed surprisingly quietly. An elderly woman with a heart attack stabilized by the time we arrived, a child with a high fever, and a minor accident with no serious injuries. It was almost 4:00 a.m., and we were nearing the end of our shift when the radio crackled. "Unit 27, we have a call from 42 Oakwood Street, elderly female reporting difficulty breathing. Code 3. Jack sighed. That address again. "Is there a problem?" I asked. "You'll see." We arrived at an old Victorian house with a dilapidated wooden fence and overgrown weeds. All the windows were dark, with no sign of life. "Are you sure this is the right address?" I asked as we got out of the ambulance. "Positive," he replied. "This is the 12th time in 2 years we've been here, and each time it's the same. A call about an old woman having trouble breathing. We arrive, no one answers the door, but it's never locked. We go inside up to the 2nd floor, to the last room down the hall on the right." Jack paused. I could see him watching for my reaction. "And no one's there," I guessed. "Not exactly," Jack said. "There's an old woman, shriveled and dead in the bed like she's been dead for weeks. But every time we call the police when they arrive, there's nothing. The room is empty, no sign of the old woman or any death." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "And it's the same every time. 11 times, Jack said, and began walking toward the house. "Let's see if the 12th time is any different." I followed him, clutching my medical bag. The front door creaked open as Jack gently pushed it. "Mrs. Raynos," Jack called out. "Emergency services." There was no reply, only the sound of wind whistling through old curtains and the creaking of floorboards beneath our feet. "Let's go," Jack said, leading the way up the stairs. I wasn't sure what to expect as we opened the last door down the hall on the right. Part of me braced for a body, part of me thought Jack was playing a trick. But as the door opened, I saw a small old woman sitting on the bed, wearing an old white nightgown. She looked directly at me, not Jack, with cloudy gray eyes that felt like they could see through my soul. "You've finally arrived," she said, her voice light as a breeze. "I've been waiting for you." Jack stood there, mouth agape. "This is the first time she's ever spoken," he whispered. I moved toward her, my professional instincts kicking in. "Mrs. Reynolds, you reported difficulty breathing." "Mason Reed," she said, ignoring my question. "You'll see many things in this job, things others cannot." I stopped, my feet feeling frozen in place. "How do you know my name?" She smiled a sad smile. "Because I've been waiting for you. Not today, not tomorrow, but you will be the last one I meet." And then, before our eyes, the old woman dissolved, not in a ghostly, cinematic way, but like steam in the sunlight. She was simply no longer there. Jack and I stood in silence for a few minutes. Finally, he turned to me. "Welcome to the job, Mason Reed. This is just the beginning." And he was right. It was just the beginning of many stories I am about to tell you. Stories about the thin boundary between life and death that I have witnessed during my 10 years as an ambulance driver. Story 2. After that first shift, I didn't see Jack Thompson for 3 weeks. Coworkers said he had taken extended leave for personal reasons. When I asked about the house on Oakwood Street, no one dared to look me in the eye. It turned out to be an unspoken test they had for new recruits. Thompson would take everyone there to see their reaction. Some people quit the very next day, Sam, a nurse who had been working for 6 years, told me. "But do you believe," I asked, "about the old woman?" Sam shrugged. "I think everyone has their own experience there. I didn't see anything. Others said they heard whispers. What about you?" I didn't recount exactly what I had seen. There's a fine line between being considered sensitive to the supernatural and being crazy, and I didn't want to cross it in my first month on the job. "Just a strange feeling," I said. Sam patted my shoulder. "So you're staying?" "I'm staying." That night was my 30th shift, and the first time I was assigned as the primary driver. Beside me was Eric, a skilled emergency nurse who seemed a bit burnt out by the profession. We were having an unusually quiet night, with only one call for minor trauma and an asthma attack. "I miss winter," Eric said as we parked on a street corner for coffee. "There's always more to do." "You're the only person I know who likes winter because more people get hurt," I joked. Eric chuckled. "I just hate sitting around. When nothing's happening, I just keep thinking about." The radio interrupted him. "Unit 27, we have a report of a man attempting suicide on West Lake Bridge. Police en route. Code 1. Eric put his coffee down. "God, I hate these calls." I immediately started the engine and turned on the siren. Westlake Bridge was an old bridge spanning the river, about 50 meters above the water, high enough that no one could survive a jump. We arrived before the police, the lights on the bridge illuminating a solitary figure. A man was standing outside the railing, balanced precariously by holding onto the iron bar behind him. "Damn it," Eric muttered. "Reed, you know the protocol for this, right? We have to wait for the police." "Look at him," I said. "He won't wait another 3 minutes." Eric was right. The man was swaying, and I could see he was crying. "I'll talk to him," I decided. "You call dispatch and tell them we're initiating intervention." Eric nodded, and I stepped out. The night was cold and damp, the sound of water flowing from beneath the river sounding like tempting whispers. "Hello," I called, keeping a safe distance. "My name is Mason. I work for emergency services." The man turned his head. He was about 40, with a scraggly beard, red eyes from crying or alcohol or both. "Get lost," he screamed. "Don't come any closer." "I'll stand here," I reassured him. "I just want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," he sobbed. "It's too late." "It's never too late," I said, taking a small step closer. "Whatever's happening, we can find a way to fix it." He laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. I killed them. I killed all of them." My body tensed. This wasn't a normal suicide attempt. This could be a desperate killer. "Who?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "What did you do?" "My family," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My wife, my children." I glanced back at the ambulance, where Eric was talking on the radio. "I didn't mean to," the man continued. I didn't see the truck. I was tired after my night shift, and He burst into racking sobs. Suddenly, I understood. Car accident, wasn't it? When? 2 weeks ago, he said. I was driving, everyone was asleep. I just closed my eyes for a second, and when I woke up in the hospital, they told me I was the only one who survived. I remembered the accident, a horrific collision between a sedan and a truck on the highway. 3 people died instantly. "I'm so sorry," I said, genuinely. "That's a terrible accident." "I can't live with it," he whispered. "They're everywhere. I see them every night, standing by my bed looking at me with empty eyes. My 9-year-old son keeps asking, 'Why? Why did you fall asleep?'" I swallowed hard. "You're saying you see them, your wife and children." "They won't leave me alone," he said, turning to look down at the dark water below. "I have to go down there with them." I began to grasp the seriousness of his situation. This wasn't just about guilt, he was being haunted. I didn't know if what he saw was real, but to him, it was absolutely real. "Listen," I said. "I don't know if you're really seeing them, but I know one thing: if they truly are there, they don't want you to do this." The man turned back to me, eyes wide. "I've seen many strange things in my line of work," I continued. "Sometimes the deceased come back, not to punish us, but because they have something unfinished. Maybe they need you to keep living for them." You believe me?" he asked, surprised that I believed he saw them. "I believe you," I said sincerely, "and I think there's a way to help you." In that moment, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, and that was all I needed. I took another step, extending my hand. "Come with me. We'll find someone to help you understand what's happening so you can talk to them, if that's what they want." After a long silence, he nodded slightly and reached for my hand. 3 months later, I received a letter. Inside was a simple thank you card and a photo of the man, now clean-shaven and looking healthier, standing by his family's grave, placing fresh flowers. The back of the photo read, "They don't come anymore. I think they've forgiven me. Thank you for believing." It was one of those rare moments in my career when I knew I had truly saved a life. But I still wondered if he really saw them, or if it was just the overwhelming grief and guilt. In my line of work, the boundary between hallucination and the afterlife often blurs in a strangely profound way. But sometimes, believing in something, real or not, is all we need to keep living. Story 3. "Reed, do you believe in hell?" Sarah's question, my new partner, broke the silence of the night shift. It had been almost a year since the incident on the bridge, and I had become an integral part of the team. "Are you starting your shift with philosophy?" I chuckled, checking the equipment in the ambulance. Sarah shrugged. "Just curious. You have a reputation for being sensitive to strange things." "I don't know about hell," I said honestly, "but I think some people carry their own hell right in their minds." Sarah looked at me with a judging eye. "You talk like a poet, Reed." We laughed and the radio crackled. "Unit 14, we have a call from Riverside Psychiatric Center. Male patient, 35 years old, self-inflicted injuries. Code 2. "Great," Sarah muttered, buckling her seatbelt. "I hate calls at psychiatric centers." "Why?" I asked, starting the engine. "Because sometimes it's hard to tell who truly needs help and who's faking it." I said nothing. Sarah was an excellent nurse, but she lacked experience with psychiatric patients. Meanwhile, I always had a strange belief that sometimes those labeled as insane simply saw a reality that others couldn't access. Riverside Psychiatric Center was an old building with heavy doors and long, dark hallways. A nurse met us at the entrance. "Thanks for coming quickly," she said, leading us swiftly through the eerily quiet corridors to a room at the end of the hall. "It's Daniel Mercer. He's been here for 3 years for schizophrenia, usually very stable. But tonight," she paused, shaking her head. "He scratched his throat with his fingernails. He says he needs to get them out." "Did he say anything?" Sarah asked, her hand ready with the medical bag. "That's the problem. He can't speak. He scratched his throat to get them out." Sarah and I exchanged glances. This wasn't unusual in schizophrenia cases. Hallucinations could drive people to do terrible things to themselves. As we entered the room, I was greeted by an unforgettable sight. Daniel Mercer, a gaunt man with tangled brown hair, was being held down on the bed by 2 security guards. His neck and chest were covered in blood from deep scratches. But it wasn't the wounds that stunned me, but his eyes clear, terrified, and pleading. Sarah immediately stepped forward, gloved, and began assessing the injuries. Luckily, They're not deep enough to hit an artery, but he needs stitches right away. I moved to the other side of the bed, nodding to the security guards. I'll hold his hands so she can work, I said, and they nodded gratefully, clearly exhausted from holding him for so long. When I took Daniel's hands, he didn't resist. Instead, he looked directly into my eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hello, Daniel," I said gently. "I'm Mason. We're going to take care of you, okay?" Daniel tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound escaped due to the wound in his throat. He looked desperate. "Don't try to talk," I advised. "Let Sarah take care of your wounds first." Sarah began cleaning the wounds, and Daniel flinched but kept his eyes locked on mine. Then, slowly, he raised one hand. This put Sarah and the security guards on alert, but he only pointed to his ear, then to my ear, and then made a gesture as if someone was speaking. "You hear something?" I asked. Daniel nodded emphatically, then pointed to his throat. "In your throat." Another urgent nod. The nurse sighed. It's his hallucinations. He always talks about voices. But I wasn't sure. There was something about Daniel's eyes too lucid, too precise that I couldn't ignore. "You want to talk to me, don't you?" I asked. Daniel nodded, and I saw tears well up in his eyes. "Sarah, how much longer until you're done?" I asked. "At least 10 minutes to clean and temporarily bandage. He needs to go to the hospital for stitches." I turned back to Daniel. "Can you write?" He nodded, and I asked the nurse to bring paper and a pen. When she returned, I positioned the paper so Daniel could write with one hand. As Sarah continued to work with a trembling hand, he wrote, "They're not my imagination. They're real. They're in the walls." The nurse read it and shook her head. "This is part of his delusion. He believes people are trapped in the walls." Daniel wrote on, pressing so hard the pen tore through the paper. "I hear them when I don't take my medicine. They cry, they need me." I looked around the room, a small space with white-painted brick walls located in a far corner of the old building. "How old is this building?" I asked the nurse. "About 100 years," she replied. "It used to be a tuberculosis hospital, then converted into a psychiatric center in the 50s. A strange idea began to form in my mind. Does this room have any history? The nurse frowned. "Not much. We actually rarely use it because the heating doesn't work well. Daniel is the only patient in here right now because we're doing repairs in the main area." Sarah had finished bandaging. "Reed, we need to take him," she said, her annoyance barely concealed. But I didn't want to leave yet. Something strange was happening. "Sarah, can you get the ambulance ready? I'll stay with Daniel for another minute." Sarah wasn't happy, but she nodded. "Don't let him hurt himself further." As she left, I turned back to Daniel, who was writing something new. "Behind the wall, secret room, trapped." "What is he talking about?" I asked the nurse. She shook her head. "Just paranoia. He always thinks people are trapped somewhere." I stared at the wall Daniel had pointed to, a solid white brick wall. But then I noticed something strange. The width of this room didn't seem to match the overall layout of the building that I had seen walking down the corridor. I approached the wall and tapped it gently. It sounded hollow. "Does anyone know anything about the structure of this building?" I asked. The nurse shrugged. "I just work here. Why?" "Because I think Daniel might be right," I said softly, not wanting to sound as crazy as the patient. "In old buildings, sometimes people build false walls to hide spaces." The nurse looked skeptical, but the older security guard suddenly spoke up. "There's actually a history here. When this was a TB hospital, they sometimes isolated patients deemed hopeless in small rooms, and sometimes they forgot about them." I met Daniel's eyes, and he nodded vigorously. "I think we should check," I said. 2 days later, I read a small article in the local newspaper. "Horrific discovery at old psychiatric center. Bodies of wartime patients found in walls." The article described the discovery of a secret space behind the wall in Daniel's room. A small room where forgotten patients from the 1950s had been locked away and slowly died. Based on the condition of the bodies, they had died in pain and despair, perhaps screaming for help until their last moments. Daniel was transferred to another facility and reevaluated. The new diagnosis wasn't schizophrenia, but a unique psychic ability. He could hear the voices of the deceased. When I visited him a month later, he was much better. His voice had returned, and he smiled when he saw me. "Thank you for believing me," he said, his voice still hoarse from the healed wounds. "No one believed me, they just gave me medicine to silence the voices." "You don't hear them anymore?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, they're at peace now, but sometimes I still hear other voices from other places." I looked at him, not knowing what to say. Perhaps he wasn't crazy. Perhaps he was simply blessed with a terrible gift, the ability to hear cries for help that no one else could. "If you hear anything else," I said, "call me, don't hurt yourself again." Daniel nodded, and as I left, I wondered how many people like him were out there. People diagnosed as insane, but who were actually just trying to tell us about a reality we couldn't see. Sometimes the difference between madness and special ability is just someone willing to listen. Story 4. There are emergency calls that leave me feeling powerless. Not because I can't save people, but because sometimes the deepest wounds aren't physical. That shift started like any other. I was paired with Kevin, a new EMT who was so enthusiastic it was sometimes annoying. He always smiled and told stories about his small family, his pregnant wife, and a 3-year-old daughter. "Reed, can you imagine?" Kevin chuckled. "My daughter told me yesterday she wants to be a superhero when she grows up, and when I told her girls can't be superheroes, she cried for half an hour." I smiled politely. After almost 2 years as an ambulance driver, I had heard too many stories about colleagues' children. "You should get royalties for being so good with kids," Kevin joked. "I've never seen anyone less interested in children than you." "I am interested," I countered. "I just have a different perspective on them." "What do you mean?" "Children are more sensitive than adults," I said, my eyes still on the road ahead. "They perceive things adults don't. Sometimes that makes me uneasy." Kevin raised an eyebrow. "I forgot you're the type who believes in ghosts." I was about to reply when the radio crackled. "Unit 27, we have an urgent call at 42 Pine Hollow Apartments. 6-year-old girl with a severe head injury. Code 1. "Damn it," Kevin muttered, all traces of his playful demeanor gone. Children's emergencies were always the hardest. I turned on the siren and accelerated. Code 1 meant a critical situation, no time to waste. Pine Hollow Apartments was a dilapidated complex in a poor part of the city. A woman in a bathrobe, eyes red and swollen, stood outside, waving frantically as we arrived. "Hurry," she screamed. "She's in the bathroom." She was clearly in a state of panic. Kevin and I quickly grabbed our equipment and followed the woman into the small, cluttered apartment. The smell of mold and alcohol filled the air. "What happened?" Kevin asked as we headed toward the bathroom. She fell," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I was asleep in the bathroom. I heard a loud noise." As we entered the small bathroom, the sight stunned both of us. A delicate blonde girl lay on the floor, a pool of blood around her head. She wore old pink pajamas, and her skin was so pale it was almost translucent. Kevin immediately knelt beside her, checking for a pulse and pupil dilation. I began to prepare emergency equipment. "What's her name?" I asked the woman. "Lily," she replied, leaning against the doorframe, her hands shaking. "Lily Carter." Kevin looked up, his eyes dark. "Severe head injury, possible traumatic brain injury, weak pulse. We need to get her out of here immediately." We carefully placed Lily on the stretcher, secured her neck and head, and quickly moved her to the ambulance. Throughout the process, I couldn't help but notice old bruises on her arms and legs, bruises that couldn't have come from a fall in the bathroom. "Are you her mother?" I asked the woman as we loaded Lily into the ambulance. "Her aunt," she replied. "My sister passed away last year. I adopted Lily. Will you come with us?" A moment of hesitation. "I need to change my clothes." "No time," I said firmly. "If you want to come, you need to go now." The woman reluctantly climbed into the ambulance, and I drove off, while Kevin tried to stabilize Lily's condition in the back. At the hospital, everything happened incredibly quickly. Lily was rushed straight into the emergency room, and we completed paperwork with the admitting nurse. The injuries don't match the guardian's story, I whispered to the nurse while the woman was talking to the doctor. There are old bruises. The nurse nodded, understanding. We'll report it to Child Protective Services. As we were about to leave, a doctor ran out of the emergency room, his face pale. Where did you find this girl? He asked, his voice urgent. Pine Hollow Apartments, Kevin replied. What's wrong? And are you sure this is Lily Carter? That's the name the woman gave, I replied. Why do you ask, doctor? The doctor swallowed hard. Because 6-year-old Lily Carter, living at Pine Hollow Apartments, was brought to our morgue 3 hours ago. She died at the scene from a head injury sustained in a domestic violence incident. We stood stunned in the hallway. But that's impossible, Kevin stammered. You just saved someone's life, the doctor said, but it wasn't Lily Carter. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Where's that woman? But when we turned back to the waiting area, the self-proclaimed aunt of Lily had vanished. 3 hours and countless police questions later, Kevin and I were allowed to leave. Both of us were silent as we returned to the ambulance. Who do you think we saved? Kevin finally asked as we drove out of the hospital parking lot. I didn't answer. How could I explain what I suspected? Did you see that girl's eyes? I asked. What eyes? She was unconscious, he said. No, she opened her eyes once when we were transferring her to the ambulance. Kevin looked at me. I didn't see anything. They were the bluest eyes I've ever seen, I said softly, as if they were glowing from within. Reed, what the hell are you talking about? I sighed. I think we just saved Lily's soul. Kevin looked at me as if I had grown another head. Don't be crazy. Do you have a better explanation? I asked. A girl dies in her bathroom. A woman, presumably her killer, calls 911 for some reason. We arrive and find someone on the floor, then she vanishes from the hospital, and the woman does too. But we touched her, Kevin argued. We felt her pulse. She had weight, real blood. I'm not saying I understand it, I admitted. I'm just saying what I think. Kevin was silent for a long moment. If it was Lily's soul, why could we see and touch her? Perhaps because she needed to be saved, I said. Not her body, it was too late for that, but her soul. Perhaps she needed to be brought to the hospital so she could pass on. And the woman's? I shook my head. I don't know. Maybe it was a mass hallucination, or maybe her spirit was strong enough to create an illusion of the person who harmed her. Kevin looked out the window. I'm not putting this in the report. Me neither, I agreed. A week later, the police arrested Lily's maternal aunt for murder. They found evidence that the woman had abused Lily for months before killing her in a drunken rage. On the day of the hearing, I visited Lily's grave at the city cemetery, a small, simple grave with the inscription, Lily Carter, 2018-2024, Little Angel Gone Home. As I placed a small bouquet of flowers down, I felt a gentle breeze pass by, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard a child's laughter. Hello, Lily, I whispered. You're safe now. I never told anyone else this story, not even Kevin. Some experiences are too personal, too strange to share. But since then, I've always paid special attention to calls involving children. Because in my line of work, sometimes we don't just save the living, sometimes we help the dead find peace. Story 5. There are places that seem designed to attract tragedy. I'm not talking about places like hospitals or morgues, but ordinary locations, apartments, street corners, or even a park bench where, for some reason, sorrow keeps returning. For our city's emergency services team, that was apartment 13 at the Westview building. Again, Diana, the EMT working with me that day, sighed when she heard the address on the radio. This is the 3rd time this month. I nodded, feeling a familiar but unwelcome chill run down my spine as I drove to the old apartment building in the city center. In my 3 years on the job, I had been to apartment 13 at least 10 times, and not once was it for a good reason. Do you know anything about the history of that apartment? Diana asked as we parked outside. Not much, I replied, just that every time we come here, someone is in a bad way. Apartment 13 was on the 4th floor of the Westview building, an apartment complex built in the 1950s with faded red brick walls and an elevator system that frequently broke down. Today was no exception. A maintenance sign hung on the elevator door. Great, Deanna muttered as we began climbing 4 flights of stairs with our heavy medical bags. When we reached the 4th floor, a middle-aged woman stood outside apartment 13, her face pale and anxious. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice trembling. "He's in the bedroom. I don't know what happened. He was sleeping and then started seizing and vomiting blood." Diana and I exchanged quick glances. She entered first, and I followed with the rest of the equipment. Apartment 13 always made me uneasy, not because it was particularly dirty or cluttered. In fact, it was quite clean and tastefully decorated. But there was a heavy feeling in the air, as if the oxygen was thicker, harder to breathe, and there was always a strange smell, not foul or musty, but something sweet, almost like overripe fruit, but not quite. We found the patient, a man in his 40s, lying on the bed, convulsing gently. A pool of dark red liquid was on the pillow beside him, and his skin had an unnatural gray color. Diana immediately began checking vital signs while I prepared the oxygen tank and drug bag. "Is he your husband?" I asked the woman, who was standing anxiously in the bedroom doorway. "Boyfriend," she corrected. "We just moved in here 2 months ago. Does he have any medical history, any medications?" "No," she shook her head. "Mike is perfectly healthy. He even ran a marathon last year." I nodded and turned back to help Diana, who was trying to stabilize Mike. "Weak pulse, low blood pressure, irregular breathing," she announced. "We need to get him out of here immediately." As we were preparing to transfer Mike to the stretcher, he suddenly opened his eyes, but not to look at us. His gaze was fixed on an empty corner of the ceiling. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse with blood. Don't." "Mike," his girlfriend called, her voice panicked. "Can you hear me?" But Mike didn't seem to hear her. He continued to stare at the ceiling, and then, in a completely different voice, deeper, harsher, he said, "Who's next?" Then his eyes closed, and he began to convulse more violently. "We have to go now," Diana screamed, and we quickly transferred Mike to the stretcher and out of the apartment. On the way to the hospital, Mike's condition worsened. He continued to vomit blood, and Diana had to intubate him to keep his airway clear. "Reed," she called from the back of the ambulance. "Speed up." I turned on the siren and accelerated, my heart heavy with a familiar feeling. We had been through this too many times with that apartment. Mike didn't make it. He went into cardiac arrest when we arrived at the hospital, and despite the trauma team's best efforts, they couldn't save him. Cause of death: acute gastrointestinal hemorrhage of unknown origin. A week later, on a night shift, I ran into Diana in the break room of the ambulance station. She was reading a stack of old documents, her face tense. "You won't believe this," she said as I sat down with my coffee. "I've been looking into apartment 13. "How did you get the information?" I asked, curious. "I have a friend who works in the city archives. She dug up all the police and medical reports related to that address for the past 50 years. Diana pushed a stack of papers toward me. "Look at this pattern." I began to review the documents. Over the past 50 years, there had been 27 deaths in apartment 13. All involved internal bleeding of unknown origin. The victims had no connection to each other except that they all lived in that apartment, and the time between incidents was usually about 1 to 2 years. "This can't be a coincidence," I muttered, feeling a chill. "That's just the tip of the iceberg." Deanna flipped to another page. "Do you know what the Westview building was built on?" I shook my head. A World War II field hospital. And according to old maps, the location of apartment 13 is exactly where the main operating room used to be. I looked at her, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "You're saying—" "I don't know what I'm saying," Diana sighed. "I just know that too many people have died in that apartment from the same strange cause, and all of them. They all reported nightmares about being operated on without anesthesia before they started experiencing symptoms." "Did Mike's girlfriend say anything about nightmares?" "No, but I called her yesterday. She said Mike hadn't been able to sleep for 2 weeks before he died because he kept dreaming of being tied to an operating table and someone cutting him open while he was still awake." I swallowed hard. Do you think it's a curse or a haunting? Diana shrugged. I don't know, but I know one thing. If I worked in a real estate office, I would never rent that apartment to anyone again. 2 months later, we received another call to apartment 13. This time, it was a young woman who had just moved in 3 weeks prior. She had the same symptoms: vomiting blood, seizures, and, before losing consciousness, she stared at the same corner of the ceiling Mike had looked at. As we moved her out of the apartment, I couldn't help but look up at that corner. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, but as I looked closer, I noticed a small crack in the ceiling, forming a strange shape, almost like the curve of a surgical blade. And for a brief moment, I could have sworn I heard a whisper from that corner. Who's next? I never shared that with anyone. Some things are better left unspoken. But since then, every time we get a call to apartment 13, I always volunteer to go, not because I want to witness the next tragedy, but because I want to try to explain the unexplainable. And perhaps, just perhaps, if someone is willing to acknowledge the truth about that apartment, this horrific cycle can be broken. To this day, I'm still searching for answers. Story 6. Not all the stories I experienced were eerie. Sometimes they were just strange, and sometimes the strangest stories left me with the warmest feelings. I met Mrs. Aliner on a rainy November night, about 4 years after I started working on the ambulance. It was an unusually quiet night shift, with only 2 minor calls in the first 6 hours. Marcus, my partner that night, had dozed off in the passenger seat when the radio crackled. Unit 27, we have a call from Sunset Hills Nursing Home. Female patient, 93 years old, difficulty breathing. Code 2. I patted Marcus's shoulder, waking him up. Time for work, Sleeping Beauty. Marcus groaned, stretching. I hate night shifts at nursing homes. Why? I asked, turning on the siren and accelerating. Because we always arrive too late, he said, his voice somber. Those frail, lonely old people, they know when their time has come. They call us not because they think we can save them, but because they don't want to die alone. I said nothing. Marcus had been in this line of work longer than I had, and I couldn't deny his experience. Sunset Hills Nursing Home was a large 2-story building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by ancient oak trees. Although it was almost midnight, lights shone brightly from many windows, and a nurse was waiting for us at the main entrance. Thanks for coming, she said, leading us quickly down a quiet hallway to a room at the end of the hall. It's Mrs. Aliner Winters. She has end-stage heart failure. We think this might be it. She didn't need to finish her sentence. Marcus and I understood. Mrs. Aliner's room was warm and beautifully decorated, unlike other nursing home rooms I had been in. The walls were covered with old black and white photos, and bookshelves were filled with books. Fresh flowers sat on the bedside table, and an antique radio played soft classical music. Mrs. Aliner lay on the bed, a small woman with snow-white hair neatly braided. Her eyes were slightly open, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Marcus immediately checked her vital signs while I prepared the monitor. Mrs. Winters, Marcus called gently. I'm Marcus, and this is Mason. We're EMTs. Can you hear me? Mrs. Aliner's eyes fluttered open, clear blue eyes shining with surprising lucidity for someone her age. Of course, I can hear you, she said, her voice weak but distinct. I'm old, not deaf. Marcus smiled. I apologize. Are you having trouble breathing? A little, she admitted, but I think the nurse overreacted. I just need a little rest. I checked the oxygen monitor, 89% low, but not immediately life-threatening. We should take you to the hospital for a checkup, Marcus said, although both of us knew this was a kind lie. Mrs. Aliner chuckled softly, a sound like tiny bells. We both know I don't need to go to the hospital. I'm ready. Marcus and I exchanged glances. She was right. In her condition, there was little we could do. Can we make you more comfortable? I asked, stepping closer to the bed. Mrs. Aliner looked at me, and for a moment her eyes seemed to see right through me. You see them, don't you? She asked softly. I froze. See what? The deceased, she said simply. I can always tell people like you, people whose eyes have seen the boundary. Marcus looked at me strangely, but I didn't return his gaze. Instead, I looked directly into Mrs. Aliner's eyes and nodded slightly. A radiant smile appeared on her wrinkled face. I knew it. So tell me, Is anyone waiting for me on the other side? I swallowed hard. This wasn't the kind of question I usually answered on a shift, but there was something about Mrs. Elenora combination of wisdom and simple faith that made it impossible for me to lie. I don't see everything, I said honestly. I only occasionally see glimpses. She nodded as if this was a perfectly normal thing to discuss. But you've seen loved ones come to greet those who are about to pass, haven't you? Sometimes, I admitted. Not always clearly. Sometimes it's just a sense of presence. Mrs. Elenor sighed in relief. Good, I hope Harold will be there. We were married for 62 years before he passed. Marcus was rechecking her blood pressure, trying not to show his discomfort with our conversation. Harold will be there, I said with an unexpected certainty, and I think your children too. Mrs. Eleanor's eyes widened. How do you know about my children? I realized I had made a mistake. I knew nothing about her family. I just knew as if the information came from somewhere outside my conscious mind. I don't know, I admitted. Sometimes I just feel something. Mrs. Elenor nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. 3 of them, Elizabeth, Samuel, and little Margaret, all gone before me. A plane crash in 1986. My heart ached. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, she smiled through her tears. It's been 39 years, and if you say they'll be there, I believe you. Marcus interjected, his voice gentle but professional. Mrs. Winters, we need to make a decision. Do you want us to take you to the hospital? Mrs. Elenor looked from Marcus to me, then shook her head. No, thank you, boys. I want to stay here in my room with my memories. Marcus nodded. I'll talk to the nurse about hospice care. As he left the room, I remained by Mrs. Eleanor's bedside. She took my hand, her small, dry hand warm in mine. You're not afraid of it, are you? She asked. Afraid of what? Death, she said simply. You've seen too much to fear it. I thought about the question. I'm not afraid of death, I finally said, but I am afraid of the pain that comes with it, not just for the one who passes, but for those left behind. Mrs. Elenor nodded. Wise, but you know, after a while, even pain becomes a kind of comfort. It's proof that we loved deeply. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. The soft classical music played from the old radio. Do you see anyone in this room? Mrs. Elenor suddenly asked, her voice dreamy. Right now. I looked around the room, not sure what I was looking for. At first, I saw nothing but photos, furniture, and flowers. But then, in the far corner of the room, I noticed a ripple in the air, like heat rising from a road on a summer day. And as I looked closer, the ripple seemed to form shapes. A tall man, standing straight, and 3 smaller figures beside him. I began, my voice thick. I think they're here, Harold and your children. Mrs. Elenor closed her eyes, a peaceful smile on her lips. Good, then I'm ready. I squeezed her hand gently. Do you want me to stay? If you don't mind, she whispered, just for a little while. I nodded and sat beside her, still holding her hand. Marcus returned with a nurse, but I gestured for them to remain silently at the door. Mrs. Elenor took a deep, trembling breath, then exhaled slowly. The next breath was shallower, and the one after that never came. But the strange thing was, just as she took her last breath, I could have sworn I saw her, not the body on the bed, but a younger, more radiant version of Mrs. Elenor rise and walk toward the corner of the room where the faint figures waited. The tall man opened his arms, and Mrs. Elenor floated into his embrace. The 3 smaller figures gathered around them. And for a fleeting moment, I saw all of them, a family reunited, bathed in a warm light that did not belong in this room. Then they faded, and only Mrs. Elenor remained on the bed, her face serene with a faint smile on her lips. Are you okay? Marcus asked as we left the nursing home after completing the paperwork. Yes, I said, my eyes still on the star-filled night sky. It's just that sometimes this job isn't entirely about saving people. Then what is it about? Sometimes it's just about witnessing, I said softly, witnessing the moment when someone finds peace. Marcus looked at me strangely but didn't ask further, and I didn't explain. How could I describe the beauty of the smile on Mrs. Eleanor's face as she saw her family again? Sometimes ghost stories aren't meant to scare you. Sometimes they show you that love transcends even death. And for me, That's both the most terrifying and most beautiful thing about my job. Story 7. The city in winter is beautiful in a special way, but also cruel. Christmas lights twinkling on the main streets create a fairy tale scene, but for the homeless, freezing temperatures mean a life-threatening danger. As EMTs, winter is always our busiest time. Car accidents on icy roads, elderly people falling and breaking bones on frozen sidewalks, and of course, the homeless battling the harsh cold. That day was a particularly cold December night. With temperatures dropping to -15°C, I was paired with Olivia, a veteran EMT who had been in the field for almost 20 years. Unlike most of my colleagues, Olivia never scoffed at my beliefs in the spiritual world. In fact, sometimes I felt she saw similar things, though she would never admit it. "Tonight's going to be hell," Olivia muttered as we started our shift. "Every time the temperature drops below zero, we lose at least one person." I nodded grimly. She was right. Regardless of shelters and city outreach efforts, there were always people who fell through the cracks. The first 2 hours were relatively quiet, a minor accident with no serious injuries, and a case of difficulty breathing in an elderly woman. But as the clock struck 11 p.m., the radio crackled. "Unit 27, we have a call from Riverside Park, unresponsive homeless man, possibly hypothermic. Code 2. "Horrible," Olivia shook her head as I turned on the siren and drove to the park. Who'd be stupid enough to be in the park on a night like this? "Maybe they don't have a choice," I said. "Or what?" "Or they're not aware of the danger," I said softly. "Alcohol, drugs, or mental illness all can impair judgment." Olivia nodded, looking out the window, where large snowflakes fell gently in the streetlights. We found him on a bench near the south entrance of Riverside Park. A thin, middle-aged man in several layers of torn clothing, curled up like a shrimp. A couple out for a late walk had discovered him and called 911. "We just happened to see him," the woman explained, shivering in her thick coat. "At first, we thought he was just sleeping, but when we got closer—" "You did the right thing by calling us," Olivia reassured the couple. "You can go now, we'll take care of him from here." As the couple left, Olivia and I quickly checked the man. He was still breathing, but his breaths were shallow and slow. His skin was cold and pale, and he didn't respond when we called or shook him. "Severe hypothermia," Olivia diagnosed after checking his temperature. "We need to get him out of here immediately." We carefully transferred the man to the stretcher, wrapped him in several layers of thermal blankets, and brought him into the ambulance. Olivia began warming IV fluids while I turned the heating in the ambulance compartment to maximum. "He has no identification," Olivia said after checking the man's coat pockets. "Nothing to identify him." As I prepared to start the ambulance, I suddenly noticed something strange. Although we had wrapped him in many layers of blankets, the man was still trembling violently, but only half his body. From the waist up, his body convulsed with cold, but his legs were completely still. "Olivia," I called, "do you notice anything strange?" She looked up from preparing the IV line. "What do you mean?" "He's only trembling from the waist up." Olivia frowned, pulling back the blankets to check. "Could be spinal cord injury. Check for any wounds." I did a quick check but found no signs of injury. Olivia began cutting the man's clothes to get better access and a more thorough examination. And then we saw at his legs. They weren't just cold and pale, they were bluish-purple, rigid, and clearly completely frozen. "My God," Olivia gasped. "This is end-stage hypothermia with frostbite. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." I drove as fast as I safely could in the slippery conditions, while Olivia tried to stabilize the patient. But both of us knew the prognosis was grim. If his legs were completely frozen, it might already be too late. At the hospital, the emergency doctors quickly took over the patient. After handing him over and completing paperwork, Olivia and I were preparing to leave when one of the nurses called us back. "He woke up," she said, "and he's asking about you too." Olivia and I exchanged surprised glances, then followed the nurse into the emergency room. The homeless man lay on the bed, surrounded by medical equipment, looking surprisingly alert. "You're the ones who found me," he said when he saw us, his voice hoarse. "That's right," Olivia nodded. How are you feeling?" "Warmer," he smiled weakly. "Thank you for saving me." "It's our job," I said. "What's your name?" "James," he replied. "James Kolosky." "James," I continued gently, "how long have you been out in the cold?" A strange look flickered across his face. "I'm not sure. I remember sitting down for a rest. I was on my way to the shelter." "Can you feel your legs?" Olivia asked bluntly. James looked down at his legs, wrapped in special blankets. "No," he admitted, "not for days." I looked at Olivia, then back at James. "Days? You haven't felt your legs for days and didn't seek help." James looked out the window, where snow was still falling. "I thought they were gone." "Gone?" Olivia asked, clearly thinking he might be hallucinating from hypothermia. "They weren't mine anymore," James said, his voice suddenly distant. "They belonged to her." "Who is her?" I asked. A strange feeling began to form. "The woman under the bridge," James said, looking directly into my eyes. "She died years ago, frozen to death one winter just like this. No one found her until the snow melted." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "How do you know about her?" "I meet her every night in my dreams," James whispered. "She's always so cold and says she needs her legs to go where she belongs." Olivia squeezed my arm, a silent signal that we should leave. But I couldn't. Something in James's story compelled me to listen. "So you lent her your legs?" I asked softly. James nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. "I didn't mean to, but every night I felt her pulling them away, making them colder. And last night I dreamed she smiled and said, 'Thank you, now I can go home.'" A doctor entered, interrupting our conversation. "Mr. Kolosky, we need to discuss your condition. I'm afraid your legs, they won't be salvageable." James spoke with a strange acceptance. "I know." The doctor looked surprised, then nodded slowly. "Yes, we'll need to perform surgery to prevent the necrosis from spreading." "All right," James said simply. "At least the rest of me is still alive." As we left the room to let the doctor work, Olivia grabbed my arm. "You don't really believe that story, do you?" she asked. I looked back through the window into the room, where James was looking out the window with a strangely serene expression. "I don't know what to believe anymore," I admitted, "but there's one thing I know for sure." "What?" "About 5 years ago, there really was a homeless woman who froze to death under Riverside Bridge. I remember because it was one of my first calls. We arrived too late." Olivia stared at me. "That's just a coincidence. He could have read about it in the newspaper." "Perhaps," I nodded, "but there's still something strange." "What?" "When I checked him in the ambulance, I couldn't help but notice his feet. They looked almost feminine, smaller and more delicate than the rest of his body." Olivia shook her head. "Reed, sometimes I don't know what's going on in your head." I smiled. "Believe me, I often wonder that myself." 2 weeks later, I returned to the hospital to check on James. The nurse told me that he had undergone successful amputation surgery and was recovering well. "He has an incredibly positive attitude," she said. "Most people would be depressed after losing their legs, but he says it was a fair exchange." "Exchange?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "He says he lent someone his legs so they could go home, and in return he got to live. Strange, isn't it?" I just nodded, saying nothing more. But as I left the hospital, I couldn't help but stop by Riverside Park. A strange instinct led me to the bridge, where the homeless woman had died 5 years prior. The snow had melted, and spring was beginning to emerge. A small wildflower was growing exactly where they had found her body, a pure white flower of a type I didn't recognize. As I knelt down to look closer, I could have sworn I heard faint footsteps moving away and felt a cold hand briefly touch my shoulder, then vanish. Sometimes the strangest stories aren't about overt ghosts or supernatural phenomena. Sometimes they are simply about the connection between lost souls, both living and dead, and how they find peace in ways we cannot comprehend. I never told this story to any other colleagues, but every winter, I pay special attention to the homeless sitting alone in the cold. Because sometimes, it's not just the cold that's taking their lives. Sometimes there's something else pulling them into the shadows. Story 8. Every neighborhood has its secrets. Stories passed from neighbor to neighbor, rumors about the house at the end of the street, or urban legends about events that happened decades ago. Most of those stories are just products of overactive imaginations or fears from the past. But sometimes, just sometimes, those stories are completely true. Forest Glen was one of the city's oldest neighborhoods, with Victorian and colonial homes built in the 1880s. It was an affluent, quiet area with ancient oak trees and meticulously cared-for gardens. And it was also the area where I hated getting calls the most, especially at night. That day was a typical weekend night shift. I was working with Ryan, a young EMT who had only been on the job for 6 months. He was still full of enthusiasm and a sense of humor, which I knew would slowly fade with time and experience. "Hey, Reed," Ryan said as we sat in the ambulance, drinking coffee and waiting for the next call. "Do you believe in curses?" I looked at him over my coffee cup. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. People say you're the type who's sensitive to strange things." I chuckled. "I don't know about curses, but I do believe that sometimes places can retain the energy of what happened there." Ryan nodded seriously, like a haunted house. "Not exactly. Not like ghosts floating around and moving furniture, but more like an imprint, a memory of what the walls have witnessed." Ryan looked like he wanted to ask more, but our radio crackled. "Unit 27, we have a call from 42 Maple Street, Forest Glen. Female patient, approximately 70 years old, reporting difficulty breathing and chest pain. Code 2. I felt a chill run down my spine. 42 Maple Street, an address I knew all too well, though I had never stepped inside. "Forest Glen again," I muttered as I started the ambulance. "You don't like that neighborhood?" Ryan asked. "Not the neighborhood," I replied, "but that house." Ryan looked curious. "What's wrong with that house?" I sighed. There have been at least 5 calls to that address in the past year. Always the same description: an elderly woman with respiratory problems, and always in the middle of the night. "So she has a chronic health issue." "That's the strange thing," I said as I drove through the dark streets. "Every time we go there, no one's home." 42 Maple Street was a large Victorian house painted pale blue with white trim. It stood alone at the end of the road, surrounded by ancient oak trees that cast eerie shadows under the moonlight. "No lights on," Ryan observed as we parked in front of the house. I nodded. "Never are." We grabbed our medical equipment and approached the front door, a heavy oak door with a crescent-shaped stained glass window above. I pressed the doorbell, not surprised to hear no chime inside. "Maybe the doorbell's broken," Ryan suggested. I knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the cold autumn night. No reply. "Emergency services," I called out. "Is anyone home?" Silence. "Probably a false alarm," Ryan said. I shook my head. "No, this isn't a false alarm. Try the door, see if it's open." Ryan raised an eyebrow but tried the doorknob anyway. Surprisingly, the door opened with a soft creak. "It's unlocked," he said, his voice slightly wary. "It never is," I muttered, stepping into the dark hallway. "Be careful and follow me." Inside, the house was cold and dark. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and something old, like yellowed book pages. The beams from our flashlights explored a wide hallway with gleaming hardwood floors and antique paintings on the walls, portraits of men and women in clothing from the previous century, their faces stern and unwelcoming. "Hello," Ryan called out. His voice echoed through the empty space. No reply, but I felt something, a sensation as if we weren't entirely alone. "This place looks like it hasn't been lived in for years," Ryan observed, shining his flashlight on the thick layer of dust on a console table. "This way," I said, leading the way up the stairs. "If it's like the previous times, we'll find the source of the call in the master bedroom." Ryan followed me up the creaky old staircase, each step producing soft groans. The stairs led to a long hallway with several closed doors. "Which room?" Ryan whispered, clearly feeling uneasy. "The last one down the hall on the right," I replied. As we approached that door, the temperature seemed to drop further. Our breaths formed small clouds in the air. "God, it's freezing," Ryan shivered. "Why is it so cold?" I didn't answer. Instead, I stopped in front of the closed door and placed my hand on the old brass doorknob. It was so cold it almost burned my skin. "Ready?" I asked Ryan, who stood behind me, his face tense. He nodded, gripping his medical bag tightly. I opened the door. The room inside was large and elegant, with a grand four-poster bed dominating the center. Heavy, dark red drapes covered the windows, and an antique oil lamp sat on the bedside table, its small flame dancing in the gloom. And on the bed, a figure. An elderly woman in a white nightgown lay motionless, her hands crossed over her chest. Ryan immediately rushed forward, his medical instincts taking over. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I moved more slowly, observing carefully. This room was unlike the rest of the house. There was no dust. In fact, it was perfectly preserved, as if frozen in time. Ryan had reached the bedside and was checking the woman's pulse. "I can't find a pulse," he said, his voice urgent. "Help me start CPR." But I didn't move. Instead, I gently said, "Ryan, look closely at her." Ryan stopped, looking back at the woman on the bed. And then I saw recognition dawn in his eyes. The woman wasn't just motionless. Her skin had an unnatural gray color, and her face held a stiffness that didn't belong to the living. Ryan took a step back. "Dead," I said softly, "long dead." Ryan turned to me, his eyes wide. "But how, the call?" Just then, a knock echoed from downstairs, slow and distinct. Ryan almost jumped. "Is someone downstairs?" I shook my head. "No one." "But the knockings." "Listen," I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. "This is the 6th time I've been to this house. Every time it's the same. A call in the middle of the night, an empty house, and this woman in the bed." Ryan shook his head, unwilling to believe. "That's impossible. If she's dead, why isn't anyone? Why is she still here?" I looked around the room. I don't know the whole story, but from what I've gathered, this house belonged to a Mrs. Florence Blackwood. She was a widow who lived alone here since the 1970s after her husband passed away. "So that's her," Ryan pointed to the bed. "I think so," I nodded. "The strange thing is, no one knows exactly when she died. The house was long abandoned, and there were no living relatives." The knocking echoed again from downstairs, this time more urgent, more insistent. "So who called 911? Ryan asked, his voice trembling. I looked into the gloom of the room. "I think she's still calling for help." "You're saying she's—" Ryan couldn't finish his sentence. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think she died alone, with no one beside her. And perhaps, in some way, she's still crying out for help, over and over again." Ryan looked back at the woman on the bed, and I could see his initial fear slowly turning into something else, empathy. "That's sad," he said softly. I nodded. "Yes, it is." We stood in silence for a while, the knocking still echoing from downstairs, as if someone was desperately trying to get attention. "What should we do?" Ryan finally asked. I walked to the bedside and gently placed my hand on Florence's hand. Her skin was cold and stiff, but I still spoke to her as if she could hear. "Mrs. Florence," I said, my voice soft, "we received your call. We're here now. You're not alone anymore." The knocking abruptly stopped. "You can rest in peace now," I continued. "Everything will be all right." A sudden cold draft swept through the room, making the flame on the oil lamp flicker. And for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw a silhouette, an elderly woman in a white nightgown standing in the corner of the room, looking at us with a look of relief. Then, the silhouette dissolved, and the room suddenly felt lighter, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Ryan asked softly. "5 times, I nodded, "but it never worked. Perhaps this time is different." "How did you know what to say?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Perhaps it's what we all want to hear when facing death, that we're not alone." We reported our findings to the police. They eventually removed Florence Blackwood's body. According to property records, she had died in 1992, over 30 years ago, alone in that bedroom. But the most important thing was that there were no other calls from 42 Maple Street after that night. However, even after many years have passed, I still occasionally return to that house. Not to go inside, the house has since been sold and renovated, but just to stand outside for a while. to ensure that Florence has finally found peace. Because in my line of work, there are emergency calls that never truly end. And sometimes, saving a person doesn't necessarily mean saving them from death, but helping them find peace after they've passed on. Story 9. We humans have a strange relationship with mirrors. Since ancient times, we've attributed magical powers to these reflective surfaces, the ability to see into the soul, even gateways to other worlds. The curse of 7 years of bad luck for breaking a mirror is not just a harmless superstition, and perhaps after what I've witnessed, I will never take the power of mirrors lightly again. It all started on a typical Saturday morning, when I had been working for almost 6 years in the emergency services team. I was on a weekend shift, a tiring 24-hour shift from Saturday morning to Sunday morning. My partner that day was Desiree, a veteran nurse with a stern face and surprisingly nimble hands. "I hate weekend shifts," Desiree groaned as we sat in the ambulance, drinking coffee and eating donuts for breakfast. "All drunk driving incidents, stupid accidents, and suicide attempts." "You finished my sentence," I said. "Statistics show that weekends, especially Saturday nights, are the most common times for such desperate acts." "Exactly," Desiree nodded, looking out the ambulance window. "It always makes me feel useless. We come to save people, but we face people who don't want to be saved." I was about to reply when the radio crackled. "Unit 27, we have an urgent call at 156 Hawthorne Road. Female patient, 16 years old, deep laceration. Parents report significant blood loss. Code 1. We immediately discarded our breakfast and set off. In situations involving teenagers, especially with severe injuries, every second counts. "Hawthorne Road," Desiree muttered as I drove through the streets at the maximum safe speed. "The rich neighborhood." She was right. Hawthorne Road was one of the most expensive residential areas in the city, with luxurious mansions and perfectly manicured lawns. Number 156 was a large Mediterranean-style house with a red tile roof and white stucco walls. A middle-aged man in a bathrobe stood anxiously on the driveway, waving us into the house as soon as we parked. "Hurry," he screamed, his face pale. "My daughter is in the upstairs bathroom." We quickly grabbed our equipment and followed the man up the grand staircase. The house inside was even more impressive than the outside. High ceilings, luxurious furniture, and expensive artworks hung on the walls. "My wife found her," the man explained as we ran upstairs. "She had locked the door. We had to break it down to get in. There's a lot of blood." The door to the master bathroom was flung open, showing signs of having been forced. Inside, a woman knelt beside a young girl lying on the floor, trying to press a towel onto her arm. "Move aside," Desiree said as we entered. "We'll take it from here." The woman, presumably the mother, reluctantly backed away, her face stained with blood and tears. "Save her, please." Desiree immediately approached the patient while I quickly assessed the scene. The girl, a beautiful teenager with long dark hair, lay on the marble bathroom floor, a large pool of blood under her left arm. But what caught my attention wasn't the wound, but the broken mirror shards scattered around her. The mirror on the bathroom wall, a large one spanning from the ceiling to the sink, had been shattered into sharp fragments. One of the larger pieces lay near the girl's injured arm, stained with blood. "Wrist artery laceration," Desiree said quickly as she examined the wound. "But not too deep. We can manage it." While Desiree began bandaging the wound to stop the bleeding, I checked the girl's vital signs. Her pulse was fast but strong, blood pressure low, but still within safe limits. She was going into shock but was still conscious. "What's your name?" I asked gently, trying to keep her awake. "Mia," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Mia, you're in good hands," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Desiree is bandaging your wound and will take you to the hospital. You'll be all right." She looked at me, and I noticed something strange in her eyes, not ordinary fear, but a deep terror, as if she was seeing something horrifying just behind my shoulder. "Did you break the mirror?" I asked, trying to get her attention. Mia nodded slightly, then whispered something too softly for me to hear. "What did you say?" I leaned closer. "She won't let me go," Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She keeps pulling me back." I glanced at Desiree, who was focused on the bandaging. She didn't seem to have heard. "Who's pulling you back, Mia?" I asked softly. "The girl in the mirror," Mia replied, her voice trembling. "She looks like me, but she's not me, and she wants me to be in there with her." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked back at the broken mirror shards on the floor. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw a face reflected in one of the pieces of face like Mia's, but with a smile that didn't belong to her. "Reed," Desiree's voice brought me back. "I've stopped the bleeding. Let's get her on the stretcher." I shook my head to clear the hallucination and focused on my work. Together, we carefully placed Mia on the stretcher and prepared to transfer her to the ambulance. "Can I come along?" the mother asked, still clearly panicked. "Yes, but only one person," Desiree said. "Your husband can follow in his own car." As we moved the stretcher through the hallway, I couldn't help but notice that there were no mirrors anywhere else in the house. No wall mirrors, no vanity mirrors, not even any reflective surfaces. That was quite unusual, especially in such a luxurious home. On the way to the hospital, Mia's condition stabilized. Desiree sat in the back with her and her mother while I drove. "She'll be fine," I heard Desiree reassuring the mother. "The wound isn't as deep as it looks. With a few stitches and therapy, she'll make a full recovery." "It's not the wound that worries me," the mother said, her voice trembling. "But why? This isn't the first time." I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to listen. "Mia has had problems with mirrors," the mother continued, "ever since she was 13. At first, we thought it was just teenage self-consciousness, but then she started talking about the other girl in the mirror." "A hallucination?" Desiree asked, her voice professional, but I could hear genuine concern. "The doctors said so," the mother sighed. "They diagnosed dissociative disorder, then early-onset schizophrenia. She's been on medication in therapy, but nothing worked. So finally, she paused. "Did what?" Desiree encouraged. "We removed all the mirrors from the house," the mother admitted. "It seemed extreme, but it worked. Mia was more stable until today." "What happened?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. The mother looked at me through the rearview mirror, her eyes red from crying. "We installed new mirrors in the master bathroom yesterday. We thought enough time had passed that maybe Mia had gotten over it. We didn't think she would use that bathroom." She broke down sobbing, and Desiree gently patted her shoulder, reassuring her that they had done their best. But I couldn't help but think about the panicked look in Mia's eyes and what she had said about the girl in the mirror wanting to pull her in. We handed Mia over to the hospital, and she was taken straight to the emergency room. The doctor's quick assessment confirmed what Desiree had said. The wound was serious but not life-threatening, and with proper care, Mia would make a full physical recovery. But just as we were about to leave, I felt a strange urge to check on Mia again. Desiree was finishing paperwork, so I slipped away to the room where they were caring for her. Mia was lying on the bed, already given painkillers, and waiting for the surgeon to stitch her wound. Her parents were talking to a psychiatrist in the hallway, leaving her alone in the room. "Hello, Mia," I said as I entered, "just checking to see how you're doing." She opened her eyes, and I noticed that the panicked look was gone, replaced by a surprising clarity. "You're the one who saved me," she said, her voice clearer than before. "One of them," I smiled. "How do you feel?" "Better," she said, but then lowered her voice. "Do you believe me?" I moved closer. "About what?" "About the girl in the mirror." I hesitated. By all medical protocols, I should reassure her that it was just a hallucination, a symptom of her condition that needed treatment. But there was something in Mia's eyes, a simple, innocent truth that made it impossible for me to lie. "Can you tell me about her?" I asked instead of answering directly. Mia looked around as if to ensure no one was listening, then whispered. "She started appearing when I was 13. At first, it was just glimpses of movement I'd see out of the corner of my eye when I stood in front of a mirror. But then she became clearer. She looked like me," Mia nodded. "Like a twin sister, but she wasn't me. She moved when I stood still. She smiled when I didn't." I nodded, encouraging her to continue. "At first, she just looked, but then she started whispering things, terrible things." Mia swallowed hard. "She told me that I didn't belong here, that my world, the real world, was inside the mirror, and I was living in a reflection. She said I needed to go back." And today. Today, I didn't know there was a new mirror in the bathroom, Mia whispered. I walked in and saw her waiting. She looked angry. She said it was time for me to come back. And then she reached out of the mirror. I felt a chill, reached out of the mirror. Mia nodded, tears starting to well up. I panicked. I grabbed a metal hair clip and threw it at the mirror. It shattered into pieces, but she was still there, in every shard, still reaching for me. I tried to run, but she grabbed my arm and pulled. That's when I cut my hand. Mia held up her bandaged arm. The doctors think I hurt myself, but it wasn't me. It was her. And I know she'll come back. I looked into Mia's eyes and saw genuine fear there. Not the paranoia of mental illness, but the terror of a child who had seen something unexplainable. Mia, I said gently, I don't know exactly what's happening to you, but I believe you saw something. Her face lit up. Really? You don't think I'm crazy? I shook my head. I think there are things in this world that science can't explain yet, and I paused, unsure if I should say this, but Mia's eyes, full of hope and fear, urged me on. I think there are boundaries between worlds that sometimes become thin, and perhaps, just perhaps, mirrors are one of the places where that boundary is thinnest. Mia looked at me intently. So how do I stop her? That was a difficult question, and I wasn't sure I had an answer. But then I remembered something, an old legend I had read in a book about folklore. In ancient times, I said, people believed that if an entity was trying to pull you through a threshold, like a mirror, you could stop it by speaking your true name. Not the name everyone calls you, but the name you call yourself deep down. Mia frowned. I don't understand. Think about yourself, I explained. Not as Mia, your parents' daughter, or Mia, the student, but your true essence. Who are you at your core? She thought for a moment, then nodded. I understand. Next time if she tries to pull you, I said, look her straight in the eye and say your true name. Claim your right to this life. I didn't know if my advice made any sense or would even work, but something in Mia's eyes changed. A flicker of hope, a spark of defiance pierced through the fear. Thank you, she said, and for the first time I saw her smile. 6 months later, I received a letter at the fire station. Inside was a thank you card from Mia and her family, along with a photo of her smiling brightly at her middle school graduation. On the back of the photo, she had written, "It worked. She never came back. Mia, my true name is Ann Duong." I never knew exactly what happened to Mia. Did the girl in the mirror truly exist, or was it just a manifestation of a psychological issue that she had overcome? But I knew one thing. Sometimes belief can be as powerful as any medicine. And sometimes all we need to conquer the darkness is to recognize the light within ourselves. Since then, I always take an extra second to look in the mirror each morning, just to make sure the person looking back at me is really me. Perhaps it's just overcaution. But in my profession, I've learned that the world is sometimes much stranger than we dare to imagine. And occasionally, when the light hits just right, I wonder if there's another world existing just beyond the mirror, where another version of me is wondering the same thing. Story 10. Fire and humans have a complex relationship. It has brought us civilization, warmth, and light. But it is also one of the most terrifying, destructive forces on this planet. Perhaps that's why when humans look at fire, we feel both mesmerized and terrified. And throughout my career, I've seen too many people so mesmerized by fire that they're willing to trade everything for it. I remember that night vividly, a hot summer night without a breath of wind. I was on shift with Ethan, an EMT who had been working with my team for about a year. We had just finished a call about a minor heart attack and were on our way back to the station when the radio crackled. Unit 27, we have a report of a house fire at 78 Blackwood Street. Fire department en route, possible person trapped inside. Code 1. Damn it, Ethan muttered. I hate fires. I understood his feeling. Nothing is more stressful than waiting outside a burning building, knowing there might be someone inside, but being unable to do anything until the firefighters do their job. When we arrived, the first floor of the 2-story house was engulfed in flames. A crowd of neighbors had gathered on the opposite sidewalk, and the wail of fire truck sirens could be heard in the distance. Is anyone inside? I asked an elderly woman who seemed to be a neighbor. I think so, she replied, her eyes wide with fear. Mr. Peterson usually always has his porch light on at night, but it's not tonight. I think he's home. Anyone else live there? No, just Albert. He's lived alone since his wife passed away last year. I nodded and turned back to Ethan, who was preparing equipment in case we had a patient. There might be an elderly man inside, I said. Be ready for smoke inhalation. The fire trucks roared up, and the fire department quickly deployed. 2 masked firefighters entered the building, while others began spraying water onto the spreading flames. I stood beside the ambulance, watching, the familiar feeling of helplessness rising within me. It was one of the hardest aspects of this job. Sometimes you can only stand there and wait, knowing that every passing second could be the difference between life and death. And then I heard a strange sound amidst the roar of the fire and the blare of alarms. Laughter. Not the cry for help I had expected, but clear, ringing cackles coming from the back of the house. Do you hear that? I asked Ethan. Hear what? Laughter, I said, already moving toward the side of the house. Reed, don't, Ethan began to say, but I was too far away to hear the rest. I rounded the house, keeping as far away from the flames as possible. Behind the house was a small backyard with a large oak tree, and under the tree I saw a figure. An elderly man sat on a wooden chair, watching his burning house with a strange smile on his face. Mr. Peterson, I called, approaching him. The man turned to me, and in the light of the burning house, I could see his face, a gaunt face with hollow eyes and a peculiar, almost ecstatic smile. Beautiful, isn't it? He asked, his voice hoarse. You need to get out of here, I said, moving closer. The house is on fire. I know, he chuckled. I know better than anyone. I stopped, a feeling of unease rising. Did you start this fire? The man just continued to laugh, his eyes reflecting the flames in a way that made me shiver. You need to come with me right now, I said, my voice firmer. We need to get you to safety. Safety, he laughed louder. There's no such thing as safety. She's everywhere. She always finds me. Who? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Margaret, he whispered, his gaze becoming distant. My wife, the woman I killed. I stood there stunned. This wasn't what I expected when I followed the laughter. Mr. Peterson, I said firmly, I think you're in shock. Come with me and we'll get you checked out. She died in the fire, you know? He continued, seemingly not hearing me. Like this fire, I started it in the bedroom while she was sleeping. She never had a chance. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What fire are you talking about, Mr. Peterson? Our old house in Ohio, 30 years ago. They called it an accident, an electrical fault. No one knew, he chuckled again. But she knew, and she never left me alone. I looked around, searching for Ethan or a police officer. This wasn't a situation I was trained to handle. Every night, Mr. Peterson continued, I heard her laughter. She laughed as if it was the world's biggest joke, that I thought I had gotten away with it. Mr. Peterson. And then I started smelling smoke. All the time, even when there was no fire, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, choking, thinking I was burning alive. His voice became strained. But tonight, I decided to end it. If she wants me to burn, then I'll burn. The man stood up abruptly, making me take a step back. But first, I owe her an apology, he said, his eyes on the flames. Margaret, he suddenly screamed. I'm sorry, I'm coming. And before I could react, he sprinted toward the burning house. Mr. Peterson, I yelled, rushing after him, but he was surprisingly fast for an old man, and while I was still several meters from the back door, he had vanished into the flames. The heat pushed me back, and I staggered back into the yard, helplessly watching the fire consume the house. At the same moment, I heard a shout calling my name. Reed! Ethan ran around the corner of the house with 2 firefighters. What the hell are you doing? We've been looking all over for you. Peterson, I gasped, pointing toward the house. He just ran in there. He did it on purpose. I couldn't finish my sentence, and Ethan didn't need me to. He grabbed my shoulder and pulled me further back while the 2 firefighters reported over their radios. Evacuate immediately, a voice echoed from their radio. The roof is about to collapse. We quickly retreated to the front of the house, and just seconds later, a loud explosion rocked the area as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and debris. It took almost 2 hours to extinguish the fire completely, and by morning, they had found Albert Peterson's body in the rubble of the house. I recounted everything he had told me to the police, and they said they would investigate the Ohio fire he had mentioned. But it wasn't until 2 weeks later that I learned the full truth. A police detective came to the fire station to speak with me. They had found records of the Ohio fire from 30 years ago. A house belonging to Albert and Margaret Peterson had burned down one summer night. The initial report determined the cause to be an electrical short circuit. But here's the strange part, the detective said. Margaret Peterson didn't die in that fire. What? I was confused, but he said she did. She wasn't home that night, the detective continued. In fact, she was the one who reported the fire, and she claimed that Albert had died in the fire. I stared at the detective, but he obviously didn't die. No, he didn't die, but the body of a man was found in the rubble. A man they identified as Albert Peterson based on Margaret's testimony. But now we know that it must have been someone else. Margaret died 6 years ago in a nursing home in Florida. She never remarried and apparently believed her husband had died in the fire 30 years ago. I tried to process it all. So, what did Albert do? He killed someone and tried to cover it up with the fire. The detective nodded. That's our theory. Perhaps a home invasion or a similar situation. He killed that person, burned the house, and fled, letting Margaret believe that he himself had died. Then he started a new life, and 30 years later, he immolated himself in another fire, I concluded, trying to understand the psychology behind it. It seems so, the detective said. Perhaps that's why we're both mesmerized and terrified when we look at fire. Because on some primal level, we understand that fire doesn't just consume, it also retains. And what it retains, the secrets, the sins, the restless souls can persist long after the flames have died. Story 11. Technology changes rapidly, and with it, the ways we connect with each other. When I started my career, public payphones were still common on street corners. Now, they've almost disappeared, replaced by smartphones in everyone's pockets. I've always wondered if those old payphones retain the calls they transmitted, all the whispered loves, the urgent messages, the cries for help. Perhaps, like the walls of an old house, they could absorb and store the emotions that passed through them. But I never thought one of those phones would call me. It was a cold winter night shift, about 7 years after I started working on the ambulance. Beside me was Victor, a big man with a thick black beard and eyes that always seemed to be smiling, even in the worst situations. We were on our way back to the station after a routine call-in elderly woman who had fallen, no serious injuries. Damn, it's cold, Victor said, turning up the heat in the ambulance. Do you believe in ghosts, Reed? I glanced at him. Why do you ask? Just curious. People say you have a sixth sense about those things. I chuckled. I'm not sure it's a sixth sense. I just think there are things we can't explain. But ghosts, like memories, I replied, my eyes still on the road ahead. I think sometimes strong emotions, fear, love, despair can leave an imprint on the physical world, like a recording that a place or object sometimes plays back. Victor raised an eyebrow. You think so? I was about to reply when the radio crackled. Unit 27, we have an urgent call from a public payphone at the corner of NH and Pine. Caller reports severe difficulty breathing, no further information. Code 2. A payphone, Victor frowned. Are there even any of those still working? Apparently so, I said, turning on the siren and turning the ambulance around. They still exist in some older areas. The corner of North and Pine was in an old part of the city, an area that had seen better days and was now mostly small shops and old apartments. When we arrived, the street was deserted, which was not surprising given it was almost midnight and temperatures were below freezing. I parked the ambulance by the curb near the solitary payphone standing under the streetlight. It was one of the old-style phone booths with glass doors, a relic from a previous era. I don't see anyone, Victor said, looking around. Maybe they're waiting in the phone booth to get out of the cold, I suggested, opening the ambulance door and stepping out into the frigid air. We grabbed our medical bags and walked toward the phone booth, but as we got closer, it was clear that no one was inside. Maybe they left to find warmer shelter, Victor suggested, Or maybe it was a prank call. I don't think so, I said, though I felt a strange unease. Our dispatch center could usually distinguish prank calls. I approached closer and looked inside the phone booth. It looked old but well-maintained, with no signs of vandalism. The receiver was hooked correctly in its cradle. All right, let's check around here, I said. Maybe the person is nearby. We spent the next 5 minutes checking in the alley and around the nearby buildings, calling out to see if anyone needed help, but no one replied. I think we should head back, Victor said, shivering in the cold. Maybe it was The ringing of a phone interrupted him. The ringing came from the public payphone booth. Victor looked at me, a strange expression on his face. Is someone calling the payphone? Maybe it's dispatch calling back to check, I said, though I knew that was unlikely. They would call our radio, not a public phone. The ringing continued, and with a strange feeling rising, I walked toward the phone booth. Reed, don't, Victor began to say, but I was too far away to hear. I opened the phone booth door and stepped inside. The small, enclosed space immediately cut off the biting wind, creating an eerie silence broken only by the continuous ringing of the phone. I hesitated for a second, then picked up the receiver. Hello. There was no immediate reply, only a slight static on the line. Then I heard it. Breathing, not normal breathing, but the labored, gasping breaths of someone in severe respiratory distress. I had heard that sound too many times in my career to not recognize it instantly. Hello, I'm Mason Reed from Emergency Services. Who is this? The breathing became more frantic, and I heard a faint voice, as if struggling to get past an invisible obstruction. Help, help me. I'm here to help, I said, immediately switching to professional mode. Where are you? Corner of NH and Pine. I looked out of the phone booth, where Victor stood in the streetlight, his face anxious. There was no one else on the street. I'm there right now, I said, but I don't see you. Can you tell me exactly where you are? The payphone, the voice whispered, then a violent cough. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the weather. You're in the phone booth? I asked, even though I was standing alone in it. Yes, dying, can't breathe. What's your name? I asked, feeling like I was falling into a strange dream. The breathing grew weaker. Lisa Warren. I felt a shock run through me. I knew that name. I had read it in an old newspaper article when I first started working. Lisa Warren, a young girl who had died of a severe asthma attack in 1997 while trying to call 911 from a public payphone. This very payphone. Lisa, I said, my voice trembling, what year is it? There was a long silence, then the faint voice whispered, 1997. My heart pounded. Lisa, listen to me, I said, not sure what I was doing, but knowing I had to do something. I know you're scared. I know you're having trouble breathing, but I'm here with you. You're not alone. Alone, the voice whispered. I know, I said, feeling tears welling up, but you won't be alone. I'm here. Tell my mom. Tell your mom. Tell my mom, Lisa struggled to say. I will, I promised, not knowing if it was possible. I'll find your mother. What do you want me to tell her? Tell her I love her, that I'm not in pain. I felt a tear roll down my cheek. I will, I promise. There was a soft, long sigh from the other end of the line, then silence. Not the kind of silence when someone hangs up, but a complete absence of sound. As if the line was still open, but no one was there anymore. Lisa, I called. Lisa, are you there? No reply. Slowly, I placed the receiver back on the hook, feeling as if I had just experienced something beyond my comprehension. When I stepped out of the phone booth, Victor was looking at me with a worried expression. Reed, are you okay? Who were you talking to? I looked at him, not knowing where to begin explaining. I think I just talked to a ghost. The next day, I spent my time researching Lisa Warren. She had died on December 15, 1997, exactly 25 years before the night we received that call. She was 19 years old, a freshman in college, and had been struck by a severe asthma attack on her way home from the library. She had tried to call 911 from the public payphone at the corner of NH and Pine, but had passed away before they arrived. With a little difficulty, I found the contact information for her mother, Elaine Warren, now 71 and still living in the city. I wasn't sure if she would want to talk to me or if she would believe me, but I had promised. Elaine Warren lived in a small apartment in the north of the city. When I rang the doorbell, I half expected no one to answer. But the door opened, and an elderly woman with gray hair and intelligent eyes looked at me. "Mrs. Warren?" I asked. "Yes, my name is Mason Reed. I'm an EMT. I wonder if I could speak with you for a moment? It's about Lisa." I thought she would slam the door in my face. Instead, her eyes widened, and after a moment, she nodded and invited me in. The apartment was small but cozy, with many photos on the walls. Many were of a young girl with a radiant smile. Lisa, I assumed. Elaine offered me a seat and made tea, and we sat facing each other in her small living room. "So," she said, "how does a young EMT like you know about my daughter?" I took a deep breath. "Mrs. Warren, what I'm about to tell you might sound crazy, but I promise you it's the truth." And I told her all about the call the night before, about the voice on the phone, and about Lisa's last message. When I finished, Elaine sat in silence, her hand holding her cold teacup. I waited for her to laugh at me or ask me to leave. Instead, she said, "That night Lisa died, I wasn't there with her. I've always tormented myself about that, wondering if she was scared, if she was alone." She looked up, tears glistening in her aged eyes. "Do you know what day yesterday was?" "The anniversary," I said softly, 25 years. She nodded. "I visited her grave. I apologized for not being there when she needed me." "Lisa wanted you to know that she loves you," I said, "and that she's not in pain." Elaine burst into tears, silent tears rolling down her wrinkled face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever it was, a dream, a coincidence, or something else. Thank you for bringing me that message." As I was about to leave, she handed me a framed photo of Lisa at her high school graduation, with the radiant smile I had seen on the wall. "She would want you to have it," she said. "You were there for her when I couldn't be." I never told anyone else about that call except Victor. And he, with his unwavering trust, never brought it up again. But I still keep Lisa's photo in my wallet. A reminder that sometimes the most important calls we receive don't always come from the world of the living. And every time I pass an old payphone, the rare ones that still exist, I can't help but wonder how many other voices still echo in those old lines, waiting for someone brave enough to pick up the receiver and say hello. Story 12. Car accidents were always a difficult part of my job. Nothing can prepare you for the sight of cars crumpled like paper, shattered glass shimmering on the road like malevolent diamonds. Or worse, the eerie silence from a vehicle that has taken too severe an impact. But of all the accidents I've responded to, there's one I'll never forget. Not because it was particularly horrific, though it was, but because of what happened afterward. It was a rainy autumn night, about 8 years after I started working on the ambulance. My partner that night was Naomi, a talented EMT with incredible composure in emergency situations. We had already handled 2 calls for chest pain and an emergency childbirth. Thankfully, both mother and baby were healthy when the call came in. "Unit 27, we have a report of a major accident on Highway 16, mile marker 35 eastbound. Multiple vehicles involved, confirmed fatalities. All units respond. Code 1. Naomi and I exchanged quick glances. "All units" meant the situation was truly bad. "I'll drive," I said, turning on the siren and lights and heading into the rainy night. Highway 16 was one of the main routes out of the city, and on rainy nights it could become extremely dangerous. As we approached the scene, I could see the flashing lights of multiple fire trucks, police cars, and other ambulances already present. "My God," Naomi whispered as we got closer. The scene before us looked like a war zone. At least 5 vehicles, 2 sedans, an SUV, a minivan, and a pickup truck were scattered across the highway, all severely damaged. Debris covered the wet pavement, reflecting the emergency lights like a bizarre broken mirror. Firefighters were working to extricate people trapped in the vehicles, while paramedics attended to those who had already been removed. I parked the ambulance in the designated spot, and we quickly reported to the scene commander, a female police officer with a serious face and tired eyes. "You too, to that blue SUV," she ordered, pointing toward an overturned vehicle. "They just extricated a woman, critical condition." We hurried to the heavily damaged SUV. Firefighters had just pulled a woman out of the vehicle and placed her on a stretcher. She was about 30 years old, with long brown hair and pale skin, bleeding from a deep head wound. Naomi immediately began assessing her while I helped stabilize the woman's neck. "Her name is Claire Thomas," one of the firefighters told us. "Weak pulse, low blood pressure, suspected traumatic brain injury, and internal injuries. She was unconscious when we found her." "Anyone else in the car?" I asked, preparing an IV line. The firefighter shook his head, his face grim. "An 8-year-old girl didn't make it, probably her daughter." I felt a pang in my chest. Accidents involving children were always the worst. "We need to get her out of here immediately," Naomi said, having stabilized Claire's condition as best as possible. "She's bleeding internally." We carefully loaded Claire into the ambulance. While Naomi stayed in the back with her, I drove as fast as I could, through the rain, to the nearest hospital. Almost 2 hours later, we finally finished handing Claire over to the trauma team at the hospital and were preparing to return to the accident scene. The doctors weren't optimistic about her condition: severe traumatic brain injury, ruptured spleen, and multiple broken bones. "Rough night," Naomi sighed as we walked through the hospital corridor. "I hate these kinds of calls." "Me too," I nodded, "especially when children are involved." Naomi nodded grimly. "I can't imagine how Claire will feel when she wakes up and finds out about her daughter." We turned a corner in the hallway, and I almost collided with a little girl standing outside the emergency room. I stopped, automatically apologizing, but she didn't seem to notice me. She was about 8 years old, wearing pink pajamas and staring intently at the closed emergency room door. A cold feeling ran down my spine. She had long brown hair and large blue eyes, and there was something eerily familiar about her. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked gently, kneeling down to her level. She finally looked at me, and I felt another chill. There was something wrong with her eyes, too old, too sad for a child. "My mom," she said softly. "My mom's in there." "Who's your mom?" I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer. "Claire Thomas," she replied. "I'm Emma." I felt as if the ground were collapsing beneath me. Emma, the girl who had died in the accident, the girl the firefighter had told us hadn't made it. "Reed," Naomi's voice came from behind me. "Who are you talking to?" I turned, seeing Naomi looking at me with a bewildered expression. When I turned back, Emma was gone. I started to say, but couldn't find an explanation. "Nothing. I think I need a break." Naomi looked at me worriedly but didn't ask further. Throughout the rest of the shift, I couldn't stop thinking about Emma, about her sad eyes, and how she stood outside her mother's room. I had seen many strange things in my career, but this was the first time I could truly say I had spoken to a ghost, a memory. I didn't know what to call it. 3 days later, I returned to the hospital. I had checked and knew that Claire was still alive, though still in a coma. I wasn't sure what I was doing there. Perhaps I wanted to see if Emma would come back, or perhaps just to make sure Claire wasn't entirely alone. Claire's room was quiet, only the steady beeping of monitors. She lay motionless on the bed, bandaged around her head and connected to many tubes and wires. There were no flowers, no cards, perhaps because her family hadn't arrived yet. Or worse, perhaps there was no one left. I was about to leave when I saw Emma standing by her mother's bed, looking at her with a mournful expression. "Emma," I called softly. She looked up, seeming surprised to see me. "You can see me." "Yes," I admitted, stepping into the room and closing the door. "I saw you in the hallway a few days ago." Emma nodded, turning back to look at her mother. "Not many people can see me." "Do you know what happened to you?" I asked gently. "I died," she said simply, with no emotion in her voice. "In the accident, I don't remember how it happened. I just remember the heavy rain and the sound of metal crashing and Mom screaming my name." I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. "You're still here because of your mom, aren't you?" Emma nodded. "I can't leave. Not now, not when Mom is like this." "The doctors are doing everything they can," I said, unsure how to comfort a deceased child. "Your mom is strong." "She doesn't want to be strong anymore," Emma said, her voice filled with understanding. "She wants to be with me." I felt a chill. "What are you saying, Emma?" "I can hear what Mom is thinking," she said. Right now, in her dreams, she knows I'm gone, and she doesn't want to live without me, so she's trying to find me. But you're here, I said, feeling an unnamed fear. Not here, Emma shook her head, pointing at the air around her. In the place where I truly belong now, on the other side, Mom is trying to go there. I looked at Claire, lying motionless. The medical reports had said her condition was worsening, not improving, as if she had lost the will to fight. Emma, I said gently, do you think that's what your mom truly wants, to give up her life? Emma looked at me, tears beginning to well up in her translucent eyes. I don't know, I just know Mom is grieving so much and I miss her. I know, I said, feeling my heart break for this child. A child who had lost everything but was still worried about her mother. But do you think your mom would want to keep living for you, to tell everyone about you, to remember you? Emma thought about this. Maybe, but she'll be so lonely. Not necessarily, I said. There are many people who will be there for her to help her, and, I hesitated, not sure if I should say this. If you stay, in some way, your mom will never truly lose you. Emma looked at me, then at her mother. I don't know if I can stay forever. I feel like there's somewhere I need to go. I understand, I nodded. But perhaps just for a little while, long enough to help your mom wake up, to let her know that you're okay. A tear rolled down Emma's cheek, a strange, almost transparent tear. How can I let her know? She can't see me. Sometimes, I said softly, people can feel the presence of their loved ones even if they can't see them. Maybe you can let your mom know that way. Emma looked unsure, but she nodded. I'll try. I'll stay until Mom wakes up. I'll help her. I think that's a wonderful idea, I smiled, trying to hide my sadness. Emma looked at me with curiosity. Who are you? Why can you see me? My name is Mason, I replied. I'm the one who helped bring your mom to the hospital after the accident. And as for why I can see you, I don't know. Maybe I just have slightly different eyes. Emma smiled, a sad and knowing smile. Will you come back? Yes, I promised. I'll come back. And I kept my promise. Every day after my shift, I visited Claire. Sometimes Emma was there, sometimes she wasn't. When she was there, we talked about her mother, about her life before the accident, and sometimes about where she thought she would go when she finally left. A week after my first visit, a miracle happened. Claire's condition began to improve. At first, just small changes, a stronger heartbeat, better response to stimuli. Then on the 10th day, she opened her eyes. I wasn't there when it happened, but Emma told me afterward with a joy I had never seen in her. Mom saw me, she said, almost jumping with excitement. Just for a second, when she first woke up, I was holding her hand, and she looked right at me and called my name. That's wonderful news, Emma. I smiled, genuinely happy for her and her mother. Then the nurse came in, and Mom couldn't see me anymore, Emma continued, a little sadly. But it's okay. She knows I'm still here. I can see it in her eyes. In the following weeks, Claire continued to recover at a pace that surprised the doctors. I continued to visit, though I had to be more careful now that Claire was awake. It was hard to explain why an EMT would visit a patient so often. Emma was still there, though she seemed to fade over time, less distinct, less tangible. Sometimes I had to look very closely to see her standing in the corner of the room, looking at her mother with a mixture of love and sadness. A month after the accident, I visited Claire again. This time, she was sitting up in bed, well enough to talk. Most of her wounds had healed, though she still had a long scar on her forehead, a reminder of the accident. Mason, she smiled as I entered. My favorite rescuer. Hello, Claire, I smiled back. You look much better. Thank you for always visiting, she said softly. The nurses say you come here almost every day. I shrugged. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. Claire looked at me for a long moment, then lowered her voice. Did you see her? I felt my heart pound. See who? Emma, Claire said, her voice cracking. My daughter. I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes I feel her here in this room. And the day I woke up, I swear I saw her. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. I looked over Claire's shoulder and saw Emma standing there, nodding at me as if encouraging me to tell the truth. I believe you, I said finally. In fact, I did see her. She's been right by your side this whole time, Claire. She's been helping you recover. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes. Really? You're not just saying that to make me feel better. No, I shook my head. I really did see her. She's been here with you. She's helped you recover. Claire burst into tears, but I could see they weren't tears of pure grief. There was relief in them. Is she okay? She asked between sobs. She's more than okay, I reassured her. She's very brave and strong, and she loves you very much. I felt it, Claire whispered. I was ready to give up, you know? After I found out Emma was gone, I didn't want to live anymore. But then I felt her there, urging me to keep going, like she still needed me to stay here and live my life. I nodded, feeling a tear of my own. I think that's exactly what she wanted. Claire wiped her tears. Do you think I'll ever see her again, or feel her again? I looked at where Emma was standing. She looked fainter than ever, almost translucent, but her face was full of love as she looked at her mother. I'm sure you'll see Emma again, I said. Maybe not in the way you expect, but she'll always be there with you. Emma smiled at me, and in that moment she seemed to glow, as if lit from within. She raised her hand in a waving gesture, then slowly, she faded until she was no longer there. I knew, in an inexplicable way, that Emma had finally gone to where she belonged, that she had completed what she needed to do here to make sure her mother would continue to live, to continue to love. I continued to visit Claire for a few more months, though less frequently as she grew stronger. A year after the accident, she was well enough to return to work. 2 years later, I received a card from her announcing that she had founded a nonprofit organization named Emma, helping families who had lost loved ones to car accidents. Emma never reappeared, at least not in a way I could see. But sometimes when I visit Claire, I feel a strange warmth in the air, as if someone is smiling at us from afar. And I know in those moments that Emma is still watching, still the final and eternal witness to a mother's love. Story 13. There are rescue calls that make you cry. There are calls that make you laugh at their absurdity. And there are calls that make you believe there's something bigger happening in this world. Pieces of a larger puzzle that we only occasionally glimpse. For me, the story of Mrs. Miller and her cat falls into the latter category. I had been working for about 9 years when I first met Mrs. Miller. It was a peaceful spring morning, and I was working with Gabriella, a young EMT who had been on the job for less than a year. We had just finished reporting from our night shift and were preparing to hand over when the call came in. Unit 27, we have a call from Sunnyvale Senior Living Apartments, Apartment 3H, Hamburg Street. Female patient, 89 years old, fall, possible hip fracture. Code 3. Great, Gabriella sighed, stuffing her jacket into her bag. A hip fracture is all I need to end a 12-hour shift. Consider it your morning workout, I chuckled, starting the ambulance. I'd rather do yoga, she grumbled but still smiled. Sunnyvale Senior Living Apartments was a large retirement complex in the south of the city. Clean, well-maintained, and thankfully, with a working elevator. The building manager was waiting for us in the lobby and quickly led us down the hallway to apartment 3H. It's Mrs. Miller, the manager explained as we followed. She lives alone with her cat. A neighbor heard her calling for help about an hour ago and called me. She's been alone for that long? Gabriella asked, clearly concerned. I came to check as soon as I got the call, but she wouldn't let me call 911 immediately. She insisted on finding her cat first, the manager sighed. I searched everywhere but couldn't find the cat. Finally, I convinced her to let me call you. I nodded. It wasn't uncommon for older people to worry more about their pets than themselves. For many, their four-legged friends were the only family they had left. Apartment 3H was cozy and brightly lit, with pale yellow walls and many potted plants. Everywhere were photos, mostly old black and white ones, showing smiling faces from another era. Mrs. Miller, a small woman with neatly tied white hair, lay on the living room floor. A small pillow had been placed under her head. She was conscious, and her eyes were bright, but her wrinkled face was contorted with pain. "Oh, you finally arrived," she said as we entered, her voice surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "I'm so sorry for the trouble." "Nothing to apologize for, Mrs. Miller," I reassured her, kneeling beside her while Gabriella began checking her vital signs. "We hear you fell." "Yes, a silly thing," she sighed. "I was trying to reach for a book on a high shelf and lost my balance. I should have known better. At my age, I shouldn't be climbing anymore. Where does it hurt? Gabriella asked, checking Mrs. Miller's pulse and blood pressure. My left hip, she replied. I can't move without feeling pain, but that's not as important as Oscar. Have you found Oscar yet? She looked over our shoulders with an anxious gaze. Oscar is your cat, right? I asked. The manager looked but didn't find him. Worry was clear on Mrs. Miller's face. Oh no, you have to find him. He never goes outside. I'm afraid he might be stuck somewhere or hurt. We'll keep looking, the manager promised from the doorway. But now, Mrs. Miller, you need to go to the hospital. I can't go without knowing Oscar is safe, Mrs. Miller insisted. He's old. He needs his medicine and is afraid of strangers. I exchanged glances with Gabriella, who was preparing a dose of pain medication. This was a difficult situation. We needed to get Mrs. Miller to the hospital as soon as possible, but she was clearly distraught about her cat. Mrs. Miller, I said gently, I think you've broken your hip, and we need to get you to the hospital for x-rays and possibly surgery. The longer you stay here, the worse your condition could become. I understand that, she said, her eyes welling up, but you don't understand. Oscar is my only companion. Albert passed away last year, and before that, all my friends, one by one. Oscar is the only family I have left. My heart ached at her words. Describe Oscar to me, I said. I'll find him. Mrs. Miller's eyes lit up. Really? Oh, thank you. He's a big black cat with a small white spot under his chin. Very old, 19 years old. He's a bit shy and hides when strangers are around. Gabriella raised an eyebrow at me, but I knew she understood. Can you prepare her for transport? I asked. I'll do a quick search. Don't take more than 5 minutes, she warned. We need to go now. I nodded and began searching around the apartment. Closets, under the bed, behind the refrigerator, all the places a scared cat might hide, but no sign of Oscar. After about 4 minutes, I returned to the living room where Gabriella had given Mrs. Miller pain medication and was preparing to transfer her to the stretcher. I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, I said. I haven't been able to find Oscar. Grief was clear on the elderly woman's face. Oh no, what will happen to him? I'm sure Oscar will show up, the manager said. Cats are very good at hiding. I'll keep looking and call you as soon as I find him. Mrs. Miller didn't look convinced, but she allowed us to lift her onto the stretcher. As we lifted her, a faint meow suddenly echoed from somewhere in the apartment. Oscar, Mrs. Miller cried out. That's Oscar, I knew he was still here. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the meow. It seemed to come from an old dresser in the corner of the living room, a large, dark wooden antique that I had checked earlier. It's coming from the dresser, I said, moving toward it. But I checked all the drawers, the manager protested. I knelt down and looked closer. Yes, I had checked all the drawers, but now I noticed a detail I had overlooked. A small wooden panel at the bottom of the dresser was slightly loose, as if covering a void. I think he might be behind this panel, I said, carefully pulling the panel away. And sure enough, curled up in a small space behind the panel was an old black cat with a white spot under its chin. It looked at me with large, golden eyes, clearly scared but not appearing injured. Oscar, I called softly. Come here, buddy. The cat reluctantly moved out of its hiding spot, and I carefully picked it up. It was tense, but didn't resist as I carried it to Mrs. Miller. Oscar, Mrs. Miller cried, tears of joy streaming down her face. Oh, thank God you found him. I placed the cat gently on Mrs. Miller's chest on the stretcher, and it immediately curled up there, purring softly as she stroked it. Good Oscar, she whispered to it. Mommy's so happy you're safe. We can't take the cat to the hospital with you, Gabriella explained gently. Mrs. Miller's smile faded. I know, but at least now I know he's safe. She turned to the manager. Can you help me take care of Oscar? He needs his medicine. Don't worry, the manager reassured her. I'll make sure Oscar is well taken care of until you return. Who will give him his medicine? Mrs. Miller worried. He needs his heart medication every morning. I'll make sure of it, the manager promised. I used to be a veterinary technician before managing this building. This seemed to reassure Mrs. Miller. She kissed Oscar one more time, then allowed the manager to gently take him away. On the way to the hospital, Mrs. Miller told us about Oscar. How she and her husband, Albert, had adopted him from a shelter when he was just a kitten, and how he had been with them for 19 years. He slept beside Albert every night when he was sick, as if he knew Albert needed him. And after Albert passed, he became my wonderful companion. 19 years is an impressive lifespan for a cat, I remarked. Yes, Mrs. Miller smiled sadly. The vet says every day with him now is a gift. He has heart disease just like Albert. When we arrived at the hospital, Mrs. Miller took my hand as we transferred her from the ambulance to the emergency room. "Thank you for finding Oscar," she said, her eyes glistening. "You don't know how much that means to me." "You're welcome," I smiled. "I'm glad I could help." 3 days later, I received word that Mrs. Miller had undergone successful hip replacement surgery and was recovering well. I decided to visit her after my shift, bringing a small bouquet of flowers. When I arrived at her hospital room, I was surprised to find her quietly crying, a piece of paper clutched in her hand. "Mrs. Miller," I called softly from the doorway, "may I come in?" She looked up, quickly wiping her tears. "Oh, Mason, come in, come in." I put the flowers down and sat beside the bed. "Are you okay? They said the surgery was very successful." Yes, my new hip will be fine," she nodded. "But I just received bad news. Oscar passed away last night." "Oh, Mrs. Miller, I'm so sorry," I said, genuinely feeling sad for the elderly woman. "The manager said he went in his sleep," she continued, her voice trembling. "At least he wasn't in pain, but I just wish I had been there." I held her hand, not knowing what to say to comfort her. "Do you know the strangest thing?" Mrs. Miller said after a moment of silence. "Albert, my husband, he always said that when it was his time to go, he would make sure I was never alone. He promised he would send someone to watch over me." I nodded, thinking this was the kind of promise lovers often made to each other. "I always thought Oscar was Albert's way of keeping that promise," she continued, "but now I wonder." "Wonder what?" Mrs. Miller opened the paper in her hand. "The manager said the vet checked Oscar to confirm the cause of death, heart disease, as expected, but they found something strange." She paused, looking at me with a peculiar glint in her eyes. "Oscar didn't have a white spot under his chin." I frowned, but the cat I found had a white spot. Mrs. Miller nodded. "I saw it too, we all saw it. But the vet said that when they examined Oscar's body, there was no white spot at all, just pure black fur." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Perhaps it was a mistake. "It made me wonder," Mrs. Miller continued, as if not hearing me. "Oscar was 19 years old, very old for a cat, and his heart was very weak. Perhaps he passed away right when I fell. Perhaps he was too scared, too shocked." She stopped, swallowing hard. "Perhaps the cat you found wasn't Oscar, or at least not Oscar in his physical form." I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted a logical explanation. Maybe the white spot was just a reflection of light, or the vet had mistaken the cat. But another part of me, the part that had witnessed too many unexplainable things in my job, wondered if Mrs. Miller could be right. "There's a photo of Oscar on the dresser," she said softly. "An old photo of him and Albert. In that photo, Oscar has a white spot under his chin, but the real Oscar never did." "And what do you think it was?" I asked gently. Mrs. Miller smiled through her tears. "I think it was Albert keeping his promise. I think he sent Oscar, or a version of Oscar, to let me know that I wasn't alone, to make sure I went to the hospital instead of trying to deal with a broken hip by myself." She picked up the photo from the bedside table and handed it to me. It was an old photo of a tall man holding a black cat. And indeed, under the cat's chin in the photo was a clear white spot, exactly like the cat I had found behind the panel of the dresser. "I don't know how to explain this," I admitted. "You don't need to explain everything," Mrs. Miller said, patting my hand gently. "Sometimes we just need to believe, and I believe that Albert and Oscar are both watching over me." Later, as I left the hospital, I couldn't help but think about what Mrs. Miller had said, about Oscar with the white spot that was and wasn't, about promises kept from beyond the grave. As a paramedic, I was trained to look for logical, scientific explanations. But after almost a decade of working on the ambulance, I had learned that sometimes the most miraculous things cannot be explained by science. Sometimes love transcends even death, and sometimes a cat is not just a cat, but a reminder that we are never truly alone.